This is Minds Blown.
And they're not only enacting such a monstrous genocide, but what they're also, an Olympic coach was killed of the Palestinian soccer team. So how can you kill Olympic coaches and be invited to the Olympics?
Welcome to Minds Blown. We are your hosts. I'm Olamide Samuel, a diplomat.
And I'm Vincent Atandi, a historian.
And we are here to blow your minds.
That's right, Ola. We're going to blow their minds with little-known stories that show you how nuclear weapons affect every aspect of your day-to-day life, all while having great conversations with fantastic guests. So, Ola, we've been talking about trying to get this conversation of nuclear disarmament outside of DC, outside of those think tanks, and really try to find ways to get it to the mainstream as it once was. And this was the idea. So I'm really hoping that through the guests that we have and the conversations we have, that this is going to reach people that never actually think much about this issue for a variety of reasons. I'm pretty excited that we're starting this off.
Absolutely. Same here. We've been talking about this for quite a while. Most of our conversations hover around nuclear disarmament and nuclear weapons and why people just don't see the same stuff we do, how nuclear weapons affect every aspect of almost everything. Without further ado, let's introduce our first guest, Dave Zirin.
Let's do it.
Now, Dave writes about the politics of sports for The Nation magazine, the winner of Sport in Society and Northeastern University School of Journalism's Excellence in Sports Journalism Awards. Dave has published 11 books, including The John Carlos Story, A People's History of Sports in the United States, and The Kaepernick Effect.
You've probably seen Dave on ESPN, CNN, MSNBC, or read his work in the New York Times, Vibe magazine, the LA Times, Washington Post, and more.
And his most recent film, Behind the Shield, is an amazing look at the NFL, which we will get into today. Currently, you can find Dave on his podcast, Edge of Sports, his radio show, The Collision, and his TV show, With Real News, on YouTube. We are so lucky to have him for our inaugural show. Welcome, Dave Zirin.
Well, it's an honor. Thank you so much for having me. I respect both of your work so much. And it's important to have these conversations, especially in 2024. And hey, what can I tell you? The idea of being the first guest on Minds Blown, I'm going to be the answer to a trivia question someday. I'm very excited about that.
We're very excited to have you here. Looking forward to that trivia in a couple of years when, we've probably got the world minds blown. So before we get into it with Dave and all things sports and politics, Vin, I've got a challenge for you. Do you think you can set us up right and blow our minds?
Challenge accepted, Ola. What I wanted to talk about for this story is so often today we hear about how organizing and protesting and going into the streets and signing petitions, that none of these things actually work. None of these things move the needle. Nobody listens. And so I really want to prove the naysayers wrong today by showing and focusing on what I would argue is the greatest citizen-led mobilization effort in United States history. So how's that to start?
Oh, that's going big. Definitely. Greatest citizen-led mobilization in U.S. history. Yeah, I can't wait to hear this.
Well, what if I asked you if there was a person in the 1980s that had such horrible policies that millions of people had to rise up and say, no, this is not going to happen? Who would that person, who do you think of in the 1980s?
80s, horrible person, definitely Reagan.
My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
We hear jokes about it everywhere.
Exactly.
Right.
Ronald Reagan, right? So we'll start there. And when Reagan becomes president, He makes it pretty clear he is not in favor of nuclear disarmament or arms control in any way. There was not a single arms agreement that he actually endorsed or liked. And when he comes into office, he talks about a winnable nuclear war. And he talks about how much money he's going to spend on nuclear weapons. His cabinet, he surrounds himself with people that are very like minded. And they start now talking about a winnable nuclear war. His deputy undersecretary of defense, TK Jones, actually said that with enough shovels, America could survive a nuclear war. All they would need to do is, quote, dig a hole, cover it with a couple of doors, and then throw 3 feet of dirt on top of it, and citizens would all be safe from radioactivity.
Wait,
This was
wait.
the type of rhetoric. Yeah, go ahead. I know you got to
Wait,
process that one.
Now listen, kids. If they're dropping an atomic bomb, we'll wait about a minute after it's all over. Then we'll go upstairs and take a look around.
wait. And you're saying this man says that if a nuclear war happens, you just get a shovel, dig 3 feet. So not even 6 feet where they bury people when they die. 3 feet.
Yeah, and we have others in his administration talking about that only 10 million people will die, and if that's the case, that's
Only
not the
10
whole.
million.
Only 10 million, right? That's
Oh, the
not
whole
that's not
population of Sweden.
right. That's not the whole population of the U.S. So it's all good.
And by the way, do you know exactly what your family would do if an attack came? Say at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. It's a good question, isn't it?
And so this is the type of rhetoric coming out of the Reagan administration, and people are freaked out, obviously. And so there's the aspect of people, just citizens, being completely freaked out because they're seeing all everywhere they turn. They're seeing nuclear issues of nuclear war, rhetoric with Russia. There's this new network MTV that comes out, which you really couldn't watch MTV without seeing nuclear war.
I want my MTV 24 hours a day on cable TV.
There was a group Genesis led by Phil Collins, super popular at the time. And one of their videos was they used puppets, and it was Reagan and Gorbachev, and Reagan having dementia wakes up in the middle of the night and he hits the wrong button. He hits the red button and blows up the world.
Morning, dear.
Hey, Nance, what a terrible dream. I am parched. That's better. I could use another one of those.
You have all this kind of Cold War culture happening and nuclear culture happening, but then Reagan actually starts spending on this stuff. So keep this in perspective as well. Reagan ends up spending trillions of dollars throughout his 2 terms on defense and on his,
Trillion.
yeah. So he spends up to $2.7 trillion he spends on defense. And
Whoa.
he ends up spending on new nuclear weapons, delivery systems, the MX missile, B-1 and B-2 bombers, all of this kind of stuff. So while he was doing this, Black children were now 4 times as likely as white children to grow up on welfare, which was now reduced to $700 a month, which left them way below the poverty line. And in Michigan, where the unemployment rate was the highest in the country, the infant death rate began to rise in his first term. In parts of Detroit, 1/3 of children were now dying before their first birthday. Food stamps were cut, free school lunches were
1/3.
cut. Yes. So all of this was now, this is how we were going to pay for all of these nuclear weapons that, but as long as we got those doors and enough dirt, we're going to be okay.
Don't worry about yourselves. You'll be okay.
You know how crazy it is that 1/3 of kids die before their first birthday? So to have 1 in 3 in the greatest country in the world, that is
City
remarkable.
on the Hill, right? City on the Hill, U.S.
Totally.
exceptionalism. Yep. And this is what's happening. You can imagine that if you're looking around and seeing all this and hearing all this, you would say, I need to do something. This is life or death. This is nuclear war. This is going to happen. And so that's exactly what happened in the United States. But it was ordinary citizens that really, start to pay attention to this issue. And a lot of this comes from Randy Forsberg. Are you familiar with Randy Forsberg? I know you're a diplomat and nuclear policy
No.
is in your wheelhouse, but
I haven't heard of Randy Forsberg. Who is he?
so
I'm guessing there's a
Randy
he.
Forsberg is a she. It's Randall Forsberg. And
Really?
she it was,
There we go.
yeah. So in Again, so much of this history is led by women and are also forgotten in this history. But in
Mm,
1979, here's this 38-year-old woman, Randy Forsberg, and she is now working at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, was a think
mm,
tank, and she was a typist working with the Swedish government. And she starts reading and learning about all the things she's actually typing and processing about nuclear weapons, and it hits her.
mm.
And so when she returns back to the United States and she's at MIT, she decides she's got to do something to try to stop this.
Politicians don't believe it yet, but they will. We will not go home and be quiet. We will go home and organize.
And this is where we get what's called the Nuclear Freeze Initiative. And the Nuclear Freeze Initiative is a simple thing where it's just saying that the US and the Soviets need to stop testing, producing, and deploying nuclear weapons. And this proposal became the manifesto of peace, the likes of which the United States has to this date never seen.
Well, I've heard of the nuclear freeze, but again, it's because it's part of the history of the work I do. But the proposal that the US and Soviet Union, what we know as Russia today, would stop the production and testing and deployment of nuclear weapons, that will sound crazy today because you'd be going up against a sophisticated industrial complex.
The other thing, Ola, is so much of what we see, and then why so many citizens just kind of tune out is because most things
Mm.
with nuclear weapons, it seems like you got to have a PhD in physics to understand.
Yeah.
And that was the beautiful thing about the freeze is you didn't. It was plain, it was simple, and it provided agency, right? It gave people to say, I can take this initiative and I can get people in my neighborhood to sign it. I can get my congressmen, my mayors, I can get all
Mm.
sorts of things happening around this. And that worked. And it was catching on like wildfire. All of this is happening in the 80s, and you start to see new groups pop up, groups like nurses for nuclear disarmament and dancers for nuclear disarmament, architects
Mm.
for nuclear disarmament. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 79, in response, the US, that summer Olympics, the US decided to boycott in retaliation for this.
And I have notified the Olympic Committee that with Soviet invading forces in Afghanistan, neither the American people nor I will support sending an Olympic team to Moscow.
So we boycott their Olympics because they did this. And then, of course, in return, the Soviets clapped back and they boycotted us, the Olympics here in the United States in 1984. So during this time, residents in Lawrence, Kansas. Why Kansas? Middle America, pretty conservative. Well, because
Mm.
Kansas was surrounded by nuclear silos. So this issue is really front and center for a lot of the regular folks just living in Kansas. And they had these annual Kansas relays, these competitive races that were done at the University of Kansas. And so
Mm.
they thought, these residents thought, well, wouldn't it be something since there's no Olympics if we could bring some Russian athletes here and have them compete with US athletes and use this as a sign of peace, get some dialogue going and
Mm.
friendly competition. In 1982, one of the residents of Lawrence, Kansas, Bob Swan Jr., an insurance agent, he actually just happened to work with professional athletes, and his friend Mark Scott, they
Hmm.
create Athletes United for Peace. And the goal was to use sports to bring people together, to bring Russian athletes and US athletes together and try to halt the arms race in some way, just make a little dent in some way. Children in Lawrence, Kansas start sending letters to their counterparts in Russia. And politicians like Senator Bob Dole from Kansas, he ran for president at one point, and Senator Ted Kennedy get behind this initiative. And in 1983, 14 Soviet athletes arrived in Lawrence, Kansas to participate in these relays. So made me think about today
Fascinating.
and could we ever pull something like this off? I mean, you think about even Ukrainian athletes and Belarusian athletes or Russian athletes, you can't even get them to shake hands after a tennis match. And here we got Russian
Yeah.
athletes coming to the US to work with US athletes. It's pretty incredible.
It is. I'm surprised they didn't get denied visas. Like, you
Ah, good
know,
point.
the Russian delegation in 2023 to negotiate the extension of something called New START, the head of the delegation wasn't granted a visa and couldn't be there because of that. So, just on a very practical level, that's quite phenomenal that they were able to pull this off.
Yeah, and it's crazy when you see it, if you watch any video of this or read any newspaper articles about it, because you have Russian athletes now, putting their arms around US athletes and saying,
Mm.
I don't want nuclear war this is my new friend. I don't want anything to happen to him. When people are together and realize they're just people, right? Like John
Yeah.
Kennedy said it, President Kennedy said it in his address at American University in 1963, his peace speech at American University, in which he said, we all breathe the same air, right? We all have children. We're all just human beings.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
The Athletes United for Peace did all sorts of things. They had bike-a-thons and they had marathons and they had public service announcements and they opened up education forums and things of this nature for athletes or for people on both sides.
Mm.
And speaking of the Super Bowl right around the corner, there were NFL players that took part in this. Todd Christensen of the now Las Vegas Raiders, Rick Sanford of the New England Patriots, Joe Delaney of the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, at one point, you even had the
Yeah.
whole Baltimore Orioles baseball team visiting Hiroshima. Again, I think about that today. If
Really?
imagine if you had today, like,
Like the
I don't
Lakers
know,
or
the
something.
Lakers, right. Can you imagine seeing
LeBron going to
LeBron in
Hiroshima,
Hiroshima? Yeah, that's incredible.
all his
And
fans would be like, "What's going on in Hiroshima?" You know?
exactly, the power of athletes. They have enormous power, right? We mentioned John Carlos and Tommy Smith at the '68 Olympics in Mexico City, but there was another athlete who kind of gets overshadowed. His name was Bob Beamon, and Bob Beamon was arguably the greatest long jumper in history.
And when I landed, I heard the people roaring. They said, we don't even have a manual tape to measure this jump. It's so enormous. My teammate said to me, Bob, you just jumped over 29 feet. I was between time and space because I didn't quite understand what I had done.
He set the world record in Mexico City, and he was one of the first members of Athletes United for Peace. To bring this home, did Athletes United for Peace and, the work they did it change the world by itself? No. Collectively, what we know now is that Reagan, while at the time was saying he wasn't really paying attention to this, we know now later that his administration admitted Reagan was deeply affected by the Day After film, was paying attention and knew exactly what was going on in the streets, knew what the Nuclear Freeze Initiative was doing, and was told and realized he had to change course. He could not keep this up. And so this is when we start to see Reagan now talking about that a nuclear war can never be fought and a nuclear war cannot be won.
We should seek to reduce the suspicions and mistrust that have led us to acquire mountains of strategic weapons. Since the dawn of the nuclear age, every American president has sought to limit and end the dangerous competition in nuclear arms. I have no higher priority than to finally realize that dream. I've said before, I will say again, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
And with his counterpart, the real visionary that ended the Cold War, Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, they signed in 1987 the historic INF Treaty, which, for those not familiar, actually eliminated land-based ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and a series of missile launchers, especially throughout Europe. And to go back to Randy Forsberg, who in some way started, so much of this in the 80s with the Nuclear Freeze Initiative, she had said at the time when they signed it, quote, "This is a victory for the peace movement." And all these years later, Ola, I would agree with her.
Definitely mind blown. I mean, from where I come from, the work I do on nuclear policy, we only see or we assume that it's the work we do at the diplomatic level, negotiating and pushing backdoor deals and all of that sort of stuff that gets, you know, agreements signed. But we're talking about the INF treaty here, which, only recently in the past 5 years was, disassembled by the US and Russia. But like this is one of the biggest stabilizers of security in Europe and across, the Euro-Atlantic dimension. And this came from protests on the street. Reagan could actually listen to people marching. Like that is, yeah, that's definitely a mind blow for me.
This history is something we really should look back and learn about, and especially to see the
Yeah.
power of athletes. What about you, Dave? How much of this did you know?
Well, it's interesting. A couple of parts I knew very well. I've written about Athletes United for Peace. I've interviewed them. I've been to events that they've put on over the years, but really just in the 2000s. And I learned the history from some of the old heads, knew about Bob Beeman, certainly knew about the bike races and the like. And also, I grew up, I don't know if you knew this, Vin, but I grew up across the street pretty much, just a block and a half away from Central Park at the 81st Street entrance on the west side of New York. So even though I was young as young can be, I absolutely remember the 1982 gathering. It might be my first political memory. That or an actual campaign, and I kid thee not, by the people of New York against Donald Trump
Oh, wow.
because he was attempting to buy a huge section of Central Park and develop it. And so my mom got me a t-shirt that said, "You gotta have park." One last thing I did not know that you said that really was cool to me was I didn't know about Todd Christensen. I didn't know about Joe Delaney. I didn't know about that level of NFL intervention into this. And for a league that prides itself on the only politics it really holds being politics of pro-military, and when someone like Colin Kaepernick steps out, it's seen as somehow anathema to the entire operation of what the NFL is. That's really impressive to me.
Yeah.
But one last observation, as long as I have the mic and I'm the first guest on your show, is I'm wondering sitting here, if we lived in a social media era, would someone like Todd Christensen, who was a big time player, would he have gotten more of a backlash than he did? Would it have gotten more focus than it did? Would people like myself, who prides themselves on knowing NFL history, absolutely know that Todd Christensen was in that mix because it would have been reported on from below? I just think it was easier back then to memory hole certain things and isolate them from sports fans. Like maybe the NFL just abided all of that because they knew it wouldn't become something that interfered with the games
Mm.
themselves. While today, it very
Mhm.
well might.
Dave, since this is my first time meeting you, could you tell me and our listeners, how you began down this path? Like, how did you first know sports and politics was going to be your thing?
The origin story is not that complex. I was really into politics. I was really into sports growing up. I never really saw how the twain met until 1996 when I was in college and the basketball player Mahmoud Abdul Rauf made the decision to not come out for the national anthem out of criticisms around U.S. foreign policy, militaristic policy. I mean, he was very internationalist in his thinking. And
Mm.
that blew my mind. And one of the reasons why it blew my mind is at this very time where Mahmoud Abdul Rauf made his stand, I was sitting in on a class at school taught by a guy whose the respect I have for him overwhelms a professor named Mahmoud El Khati. And Mahmoud El Khati taught a class called The Black Athlete since 1945. Now, that being said, you know why I said sitting in on a class? Because I didn't get in the class because it was so popular. But I was so into the topic that even though my other grades definitely needed the attention, the actual grades that went into my GPA, I would sit in on his class and my roommate got into the class. And so I would read my roommate's books and sit in on the class because I was like, this is everything I've always wanted. I'm a political person. I'm a sports person. This is blowing my mind. And then when Mahmoud Abdul Rauf made the decision to not come out for the anthem, it crystallized what I'd been learning in Mahmoud El Khati's class. Yes, there are two Mahmouds in this story, not mishearing me. And so Mahmoud El Khati teaches me about the past, and Rauf is teaching me about how this applies to the present. And I was thinking to myself, I want to be somebody who extends this history into the present because
Mm.
the history could not be more relevant, particularly at the time as you're starting to see sports becoming this hyper exalted, brought to you by Nike platform. because it was in the 90s under the leadership of organizations like ESPN and individuals like Michael Jordan, where you see US sports really become a global entity, and soccer, which of course springs organically from all the countries of the earth, became something that was rivaled by the ways in which US sports, particularly basketball and baseball, made
Hmm.
international inroads. A book came out in 1998, I believe, called Redemption Song: Muhammad Ali and the Spirit of the
Mm.
1960s. And that's where I learned about Ali. And it was also written by an author, a British author named Mike Marquesi, with a degree of flair and excitement that made me say, wow, sports history doesn't have to be boring, because a lot of what I'd read was kind of academic and dry. And so to read it written with a kind of verve and rhythm made me not only began my, as Ben well knows, my obsession with Ali's history, but also my belief that the writing itself didn't have to be something that wouldn't rise to the level of the best kind of sports writing, which is sports writing that certainly, raises the heartbeat.
Mm. To see these magazines and the sports journalism just go by the wayside is so awful. It's just so disheartening.
Sports is big business. Sports has never been more powerful in communities. And so this is a function also of economic inequality and the fact that the billionaires who mine sports are also, very chummy with the billionaires who have been coming in from VCs, venture capitalists who are
Mm.
buying up our newspapers. And they want sports to be the toy department of the media world. And then if you're dealing with very tough cuts, the toy department will be the first thing to go. So some of this is honestly been, I think, pernicious and intentional. And
Mhm.
also some of it, though, is just about ignorance and not realizing the importance of what sports coverage brings to our lives. I mean, come on, look at what happened with the New York Times. The New York Times sports page was part of a guild strike that actually brought the New York Times editors to their knees. So what do? They eliminate this unionized department of the paper and replace it with a non-organized, non-union entity in the Athletic. I mean, sometimes this is also just about union busting, and that's distressing as well in and of itself. And union busting is a function of economic inequality, which is what I'm saying is underlying the attacks on media, the attacks on watchdogs, and the attacks on the sports department. And let's not get it twisted. The LA Times sports department had a huge task in front of it in looking deep into the 2028 Olympics, which are set to be staged in LA. And
Hmm.
every Olympics brings corruption. Every Olympics brings debt, displacement, the militarization of public space, gentrification. They all bring these side effects that hurt communities. And it's up to the media to expose them. So you need these social movements. But if people aren't aware of the corruption, where are the social movements supposed to come from in a mass way beyond like the far too small organized left? So this is where we're at. And in Los Angeles, where, believe me, the powers that be want these Olympics in every conceivable way, it just feels very, very suspicious and fishy to me that the entire sports page of the LA Times gets gutted right as the Olympic work in LA is being ramped up.
Hmm.
So one thing that I often think about you, Dave, specifically you, is how I try to figure out watching sports, liking sports, but then also being disgusted with aspects of sports. Like, what am I'm watching the NFL, but yet I'm constantly critical of the NFL. So for you, that this is your livelihood, this is your, passion, your life. How do you juxtapose it? How do you deal with, loving sports, loving athletes, writing about it, but then also needing to be critical of it in so many different ways, especially I would say with the NFL.
We're in a very difficult situation with regards to sports consumption because of how it's being used and operated as a cudgel. I mean, I just think we have to think of ourselves as fans as being a movement unto ourselves and try to figure out ways that we can criticize sports, point out what's wrong about sports, but then also fight to reclaim sports, not reject it. I mean, look at the Olympics, which I just mentioned and classified it as in being involved with debt and displacement and hyper militarization. The Olympics also have some of the most beautiful sports on earth, and they're also sports that are only really consumed sometimes during the Olympics.
Hmm.
And so it's a chance for people who are involved in these beautiful artistic acts to actually be seen and appreciated. And that to me is a beautiful thing. And that to me is something worth defending. I love that the sports get this platform. I don't love the way, like barnacles on a boat, so many negative political agendas are attached to sports. So look at the Super Bowl right now, where the right wing has decided that Taylor Swift, just because she said 4 years ago that she was going to vote for Biden, is somehow a symbol of this folk country singer from Tennessee is now the symbol of left wing decay. So they've decided that Kansas City has to lose, and they're losing their minds, by the way, about Taylor Swift for people listening to this outside the United States. And partly because they're afraid of the influence that she has, since she has more social media followers than Donald Trump by the
Yes.
millions. I mean, they're out for grievance and they're out for blood, and sports is a part of that agenda, which is exactly why I think sports, which I think at its best can speak to the best angels of our nature, we need to fight to reclaim it, not to reject it.
Here, here.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
It's
And
like
just thinking,
rejecting art. I mean, and I'm going to point this out too, is like art is produced under horrific circumstances. Music is produced under horrific circumstances. Yet you never hear people say we need to reject music or we need to reject art. But you do hear a lot, we need to reject sports. And I think if we understood sports as art, I think our approach to it would be very different and frankly much healthier
Mm.
politically.
football doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in
Mhm.
Nigeria. When we speak of football, we're speaking of soccer, right? So we don't really know much about American football or the NFL. So can you like explain to me and our listeners, many of which would also be from the African continent, this power of the NFL and this connection with the U.S. military and the NFL?
Yeah, we should probably call it American football or something like that because, I had a friend in Argentina who called football imperialismo. He says, we play our football, you play football imperialismo. The thing about football is that it's hilarious to me that it's so popular in the United States, yet can't really find foreign purchase anywhere, despite its best efforts. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it is so much a game that is built around the concept of settler conquest. I mean, and that's just a foreign concept to much of the world. This idea of constantly moving down the field to acquire ground and doing it in a way that not doesn't just reflect militarism, but features it. Like the quarterback is called a field general. The throws are called bullets and bombs. You're approaching a defense that's trying to push you backwards. I mean, I always have thought of football as that it's like a child's idea of war: advancement, rejection, retreat, and exciting. Real war, when you speak to people who fought them, tends to be long, long periods of boredom, followed by moments of incredible adrenaline horror shows that, send your blood pressure through the stratosphere. But football to me is so militaristic and so based on this idea of conquest that it just is not the cup of tea for most of the world.
Staying with football, American football, and even internationalism, when you wrote the Kaepernick book, The Kaepernick Effect, and for those listeners that have not read that book, I obviously highly recommend it. But it's not a biography of Colin Kaepernick. That's not what the book is about. It's
Mm.
looking at his effect on sports and on individuals at all levels. And You learn about the backlash in more conservative areas and so on and so forth. And now when I watch Premier League soccer, football, European football, at the beginning of every match, they take a knee in solidarity against racism. And that's all they do, right? And so now that this is past, looking back, what were some of the things that surprised you when you researched that book, and how do you feel now? Do you feel like it's become performative? It's been hijacked? What are your thoughts on where we are since when Kaepernick decided to take that knee?
And I think taking a knee during the anthem is such a challenge. The idea of patriotism, particularly the militaristic patriotism that accompanies the NFL, that it's never been colonized as a gesture. It's never been gentrified. Like I got a note from a neighbor who was staying in a kibbutz in Israel before October 7th. And after October 7th, they played the Hatikvah, which is the military anthem of Israel for his kibbutz. And he took a knee during the
Wow.
Hatikvah and left the kibbutz. Like that idea of taking a knee is such a direct challenge that I don't think it's can be
Mm.
gentrified, colonized, or I mean, of course, any gesture can be performative if you don't believe in what you're doing, but it is a gesture where, say, you're one of those people who are like, "Shoot, I think Colin Kaepernick was cool. I'm going to do it too." The people who want you to pay a price for that are not going to care. But what I learned in talking to people, like especially all these high schoolers, is that for them, their turning point in their thinking was not Colin Kaepernick taking that knee, but when they were really young, when they were 10, 11 years old in 2012, when Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman. Trayvon Martin, a young man, not even a man at all, he was a boy, he was a child, stalked and killed by a wannabe police officer in Sanford, Florida. That is what shook them towards consciousness to say that, my goodness, my black life does not matter. And when Kaepernick took a knee, this is one of the things I learned doing it, is that it was like bequeathing a language onto athlete activists. Like, here is a language about how you can protest. Here is a language for you that you can have your opinion heard about how this country values black life. And maybe people will hear it and maybe they won't. Or maybe it'll just upset all the right people and stir up a hornet's nest. But that's the bravery piece that a lot of these young people engaged in. And it didn't get the publicity. They didn't get any commercial contracts out of it. All they got out of it, in some cases, was changing their community forever. And in other cases, their family had to leave the town entirely because of death threats made against their person. So that was one of the important things I learned doing the book. Another thing I learned with all these young people taking a knee is that what's not just football. Boy athletes, girl athletes, transgender athletes, every possible sport you could think of, the band in some cases, national anthem singers in some cases, like a real interesting variety of folk. Super interesting. And it says something about the universality of the gesture, that anywhere where patriotism is put in your face, you can challenge that and you can do something about that. Just food for thought.
Yeah.
And that really changed me. And if there was just one last thing I learned, I'm sorry to go on,
No.
but if there's just one last thing I learned that was very dear to me, is that the athletes who organized their locker room before doing it tended to have a much easier time than the athletes who were just like, I'm going to do this as a solo venture, which is a great lesson for young people about organizing and about numbers.
Yeah, I don't think that you never know how many people it affected, because I was teaching in Sanford, Florida when Trayvon was murdered.
Mm.
And I remember I was teaching a course on African American history, and we were actually discussing the murder of Emmett Till when the 911 tapes came out, and seeing all those students crying at their desk and saying, "Professor, they're still killing us for no reason except that we're black." And so again, even if it's, giving them just some sort of agency where they can then take a knee. Yeah, it matters. It matters in ways that, I obviously can't even comprehend. So yeah, it's a great book though that I highly recommend our listeners pick up among all your books.
So, Dave, on your TV show, you've been discussing to a large extent how the sports world, both in the US and outside, are actually failing when it comes to the genocide taking place in Palestine. What do you think would happen if an athlete like Kaepernick, for example, were to speak out for Palestine?
Well, we know that the backlash would be extreme because we've already seen some athletes try to speak out and what they've received. I know of athletes who are trying to organize athletes for a ceasefire, and they're having an incredibly difficult time. I mean,
Mm,
it's always tough when you feel like the world is going to fall on your shoulders and you only have a couple of years to make money. And when you have this living memory of Colin Kaepernick being blackballed, denied the right to make a living, that weighs heavily on the mind of the athlete. And also, it's for some athletes, it just feels like, well, who am I to say something that's happening thousands of miles away, even if the local connections are very extreme. And like Angela Davis said, she said, from Ferguson to Palestine, freedom is a constant struggle.
fans, the sports community, the sports world is failing, you
Oh,
know,
failing
when it comes
terribly.
to.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it very much upsets me because when we speak about the toll being taken on Gaza and to a lesser extent the West Bank, I don't think
Mm,
people realize how many athletic associations have been bombed. I don't think people realize how many athletes have been killed. I don't think people realize that dozens of administrators, workers for these sports foundations have been killed. I mean, this idea that Israel has put forward, in the US too, that this is a total war against the people of Gaza, and Gaza is Hamas, and Hamas is Gaza, and those words are almost interchangeable. And phrases that have existed in the movement for decades, like from the river to the sea,
mm,
Palestine will be free, doesn't become this statement of aspiration and freedom, which is how I've always understood it, but a statement of genocide against the Jewish people. I mean, that is as propagandistic a trick that's just been pulled off as anything I remember in decades. So I think the international sports world is failing Palestine because the Palestinian sports community has been devastated to such a degree that it
mm,
makes you wonder why no solidarity exists. And frankly, it makes you wonder why Israel would be given a red carpet to be at the Olympics when they're not only enacting such a monstrous genocide, but what they're also, an Olympic coach was killed of the Palestinian soccer team. So how can you kill Olympic coaches
Mhm.
and be invited to the Olympics? That's one of the things
mm.
that's weighing on my mind.
I want to bring it back to what we originally started with, which with your research with Athletes United for Peace and athletes in general with the Cold War, if you thought, you know, they made a significant difference. And can we see that again? Do you think the era of kind of fighting for something maybe it seems very abstract as nuclear disarmament is gone? That era is gone. Do we think there's a little bit of hope there that we can actually organize around this issue, which I know is a difficult one?
Yes, it makes a big difference because of the platform that athletes hold and because athletes tend to come from more poor and working class backgrounds. So when they speak out, they're speaking directly to a constituency that identifies with them. And yes, we're going to see it again. It ebbs and it flows. It goes up, it goes down. That's what history shows us. And ideally, the role that people like you both can have and the role that I try to play is that when it flows and does not ebb, we don't want people recreating the wheel. We want people figuring out how they can stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, I'll tell you guys a quick story. I was on a call, like a secret call with these athletes talking about how to organize for a ceasefire, and they produced a wonderful statement calling for a ceasefire. But I had to weigh in and say, I love this statement, but there are names here that need to be there. There are names not here in the statement that should be there, like Muhammad Ali, like John Carlos and Tommy Smith, like Wyoming Attias, like people who stood up, and you are part of that tradition. And you should use the fact that you're part of that tradition to even give more validity to the fact that you're taking a stand.
We're we're getting to that point where, we might not be able to turn back the tap when it comes to nuclear risk. And it's just really scary that this escalation is going very much unnoticed in the public sphere. And so my question is, how should athletes, sports journalists, the sports world, like what can we do to educate people about it?
I think one of the things that I've seen that's been very interesting is people taking their protests to stadiums. And stadiums can be sometimes the most publicly funded space in your city, even though it costs a lot of money to get in. And so things like demonstrations outside stadiums, banner drops inside stadiums. I mean, this is one of the legacies of the civil rights movement is the understanding of mass communication and mass media in education. And I think we have to live that. I mean, that's what the civil rights movement taught themselves because it hadn't existed before in the same kind of way. And that's the legacy we need to stand on is understanding that we cannot let, and I'm sorry to sound like the Washington Post, so I'm gonna alter it a little bit. We cannot let protest die in darkness.
So, when Muhammad Ali fought George Foreman in Zaire, which we now know as the Democratic Republic of the Congo today, Ali was supported by the local population much more than Foreman was. And this dynamic was captured in the film When We Were Kings. And
Mhm.
also, the chant Ali Bomaye, was recently featured as the title of the game's hit record with 2 Chainz and Rick Ross. Can you talk a little to the audience about this dynamic? Why that happened and how it affected each fighter?
Well, I mean, it was, first of all, the fact that there was a fight in the first place in what was called Zaire was a huge deal. To have a fight on the African continent, to have a fight in a place where there would be signs when you would land at the airport that said Zaire, where Black power has become a reality. I mean, that had a strong effect on people. There was
Mm,
also a pretty awful underbelly of it where the dictator of the country, Mobutu Sese Seko, was somebody torturing dissidents, killing people. He was a terrible Western backed dictator. But that's not what people saw. They saw, I mean, the greater symbolism was not who Mobutu was. The greater symbolism was actually the fight being in Africa. That was huge. And it was the sort of thing where it made people feel a sense of ownership of an Ali victory being important to them. Now,
mm,
why didn't they gravitate to George Foreman, who African American, grew up very poor in Houston? Why didn't he represent that? Well, George Foreman was somebody who was seen, fairly or otherwise, in 1968 as at the Olympics as being the counter voice to Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Because the day after they raised their fists, he bowed to the audience after winning gold and waved a small American flag. So he was painted as being the opposite of the revolution that was occurring in Black athletics. When you factor in also that he arrived in Zaire with the kind of attack dog, I mean, literally, he walked in with a dog on a leash. It just happened to be the kind of dogs that were used by the imperialists to attack from Western Europe to attack
mm,
the freedom fighters of sub-Saharan Africa. So he was painted right away as being a kind of, for better or worse, for fair or not, the kind of imperialist champion coming
mm,
to conquer Zaire. And Muhammad Ali was seen as the person defending Black power. And so Ali Boumaier, when you factor in that Ali was also a great underdog in the
mm.
fight, I mean, it created a perfect set of circumstances for Ali Boumaier becoming a phrase that not only would be heard through the ages, but when I was in Louisville for Ali's funeral, and the procession went by, people in Louisville were chanting Ali Boumai. That's the
Yeah, that
power
just gave me chills.
of internet.
Dave, my friend, we
That's
cannot thank you enough for coming on for our first episode. It was great to have you on. Thank you so much, Dave. Well, Ola, we did it. First episode in the books, and we could never have done it without our team. So sincere thanks to Lex International, Jason, the whole team behind the scenes. For those of you that are listening, if you liked this episode, we encourage you to hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us at Twitter at minds_blown_pod. We will see you soon for the next episode. So bye, everybody.
Mind Blown is produced by Jackson Street Collective and made possible by Lex International.